Welcome to the One Within, all to another episode of InnerVerse. Man, I'm excited for this one. It is a long time coming. We have the return of my good buddy Dylan Saccoccio, author of the Spirit World book series. Also, since we last had him on, he's turned out two new books. One of them is the fourth in the Spirit World series called A God's Acre for Winds of the Soul, and his amazingly I'd say controversial, but super helpful book, Get Mad or Get Realistic, about how to actually be a man in this world of effeminized communism. So we have so many things. Dylan's provided an excellent outline of subjects he's prepared to speak about. Definitely appreciate that. We don't always get that pleasure with a guest to be super organized and on point. Much to say, but make sure that you are following Dylan on Instagram if you want his updates. Right now it's _GodsAcre. Also, for sure, you should have read the Spirit World book series by now or checked out the audiobook versions. You can find them on Amazon and Audible. And in every episode of this podcast, you will see a link in the show notes to July's End with Black Swans, the third book in the Spirit World series that I narrated and produced as an audiobook. And there's so much there. It is a huge gift to all of us who are interested in syncretizing all of the mythological, symbolical ciphers and things of that nature. That probably one of the main reasons you're listening to this show is because we get into that type of gravy. Dylan's work has completely changed my life, totally upgraded me in terms of my ability to comprehend this stuff. I know I'm going on a little bit, but I got to say, before Spirit World for me, I was kind of lost in the mysticism of it all. Like, are these really real concepts? Are there really gods out there? And like, totally not sorting it all out. And once you can put it into this syncretic perspective and see that it's really one system, and its value is in how it reflects nature, and its worthlessness is in how it gets you lost in mysticism. No different than the because I said so scientism cults of, it's the left brain versus the right brain, but both sides of this mafia war are equally complicit in the way that they play the game, which is through false authority. And nature's the real authority. We're going to get into that today, exploring language, exploring Dylan's newest research that is probably going to be going into his next book that he's already far underway in. So with that being said, let's get into it. Dylan, welcome back to InnerVerse. How you doing, man?
Man, it's exciting to be back with you. And for the audience, chance played a huge role in this being possible. And you changed my life as much as I've changed yours. And I think there's something about us that we have this like synergy. We're very complementary to each other. We're kind of like opposites, but the same. Like in terms of the way our ability to see things and see the same thing without talking to each other. It's just dependent on our access to information, and so it's been a real honor to know you, and I'm very grateful for God that you were brought into my life. For the audience, the reason I was on Crow is because Chance recommended my books. I think you had Crow on as a guest or something, or however that happened. And so that brought Jason and Rose into my life, and they're friends now. And so I have a very small group of people who have the best credibility in this space in my corner, at least in terms of my work. And, that little group of people has, it got the series popping in sales. So now that it gave me an ability to at least get by without having to work. So what I've done is I've traded in inspiration and motivation, and I've just become disciplined, and the tenacity to show up every day and work hard. I'm going to publish a third book this year. And that's how productive I've been able to be, by just getting realistic and, not waiting for the moment to hit, just every day. Just whether I want to go or not, I got to go to the gym and build my body. I've got to read and educate myself and grow my mind. And then I've got to put it out so I can help others expedite the process. And that's really what my work has been all about. It's to save the viewers thousands of hours of their life, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And it's also to give you free time, because once you are familiar with the knowledge in spirit world, you'll be able to see that it's not opinion based. It's just facts. And 99.9% of this space makes so many errors and is putting out erroneous information that if you're watching them, you're going to be led astray. So Spirit World allows you to get all this information in a quick, digestible format, and then start incorporating it into your own work, like Pat Life does, like Rob does, and especially like you. And now it's like amazing to see you seeing all these things in the process quickening and hitting me up with all this mythology or history that you're looking at. And you're like, see, look, it's the symbolism in this historical account as well. And, it really is exciting, because that's the only way we're going to be able to figure out what's going on in this world, is to get rid of and be able to expose all the absurdities and falsities. So thanks for having me back. And for your audience members who have supported Spirit World and Get Mad or Get Realistic and my fantasy series, The Tale of Honora, thank you so much. And I'm very grateful to be here.
Yeah, man. I love how also coinciding with your hugely prolific writing from the last year is getting way stronger physically. I mean, you say that directly in the first chapter of the newest Spirit World book. You must get strong physically and mentally. Both aspects require doing the work, but they go hand in hand. Like time is a slippery thing. It is not exactly like we have this linear concept of it, but I find that when I spend the time doing what's best for my health and like taking the time to do that, I feel like I have more time throughout the rest of the day, even though I maybe spent 2 hours on my body or 3 hours on my body that day. It's a kind of an interesting paradox like that. So happy to see that you're definitely getting stronger on all levels, and that the work, I really enjoyed the newest book, A God's Acre for Winds of the Soul, more than the whole rest of the series, partly because they build on each other. And it's like, once something is really rolling, it just gets bigger and bigger. But yeah, I think that what is most valuable about it is once you see the pattern, the pater, the pata of it all,
I never even connected that. The fact that you just connected that is hilarious.
Pattern. It is. It's what it is, man. Yeah. There's one pattern. There's one pata of it. And once you have a grasp on it, you're like, okay, I'm no longer lost in the sauce of the mystic side of things. And I really appreciate when I figured this out from Wilhelm Reich, his work, Ether, God, and Devil, when he pointed out that like the mysticism is exactly the same as the mechanism, whenever it's just way out there in the whole, because I told you so. The yugas are this much time, and like we know the age of a Brahmin day, and like it's millions of years, and trust us, we just know. Like what's up with that? What's one of my favorite parts of the new book? And it's not, I don't think, in your notes, but maybe worth touching on, is the idea of the larger cycles of time, as the priest class has offered it to us in various forms. Could you like maybe talk about that and your opinion on these larger time cycles?
Yes. So if people want to go in depth with this, look at my Crow episode 383. And so I'm really prepared today. What I'm trying to do moving forward is make sure that each podcast I do is unique. So I have like this outline, and I give you the choices, and so that I never do these subjects with other people, so that there's a draw to each one of these podcasts. But that being said, talking about it generally, what you find when you go back in time is that these people have always been wrong. And the reason for that is because these cycles happen so gradually that you can only really determine them over time through calculation and based on the records you have available. So if those records are anything less than perfect, you're going to have issues. Now, of these people, of these priest class, the Vates, the seer, that's where Vatican comes from. And in the ancient Irish or like the Druidic system, which is all the same system, by the way, and book 5 is really going to go into that. But you'd have the Ubages. And so these astronomers, whether it's bishops, that's in the first episode of Crow that I did the etymology of bishop and show how it means seer, right? Episcopal, all that stuff. It's the astronomers. And these people were responsible for foretelling future events and keeping track of the cycles so that you knew when to grow crops, you knew when to do everything. And that's how civilization thrived. And the reason that's so important is because you need starchy grains. There's not one empire that ever thrived that didn't have the means of growing starchy grains so you can feed the soldiers and all the people that are going forth and expanding. So when you look at this stuff in history, they've never been right. But the closest group of that were the Chaldeans that were right, that were like the closest to everything being precise. And one of the things that Sosigenes did, is a Chaldean astronomer from Egypt, is when they called upon him, Julius Caesar, or whoever was around at that time. I'm not sure if Julius Caesar is a historical person, but at least through his work and his books, there was somebody that, played that role or whatever it is. They were able to correct the calendar, and that calendar stayed on its reckoning for nearly 1,500 years, despite the precession. But it still eventually got off its reckoning by like 11 days or something, and that's when the Gregorian calendar needed to be adjusted, because if they had the year under Caesar at 365.24 days, and then with the Gregorian, they had to make it 365.2425. And so we have that calendar today. And as a result, that calendar mirrors the cycle of the sun. And so even though it might not be the exact calendar for whether it's like the lunar calendar or the exact measure of everything, it's good enough so that the farmers and the common people can rely on without having to know astronomy. So we know based on the date, we can look at any calendar and know when spring is, even if it's not like exactly the right time. And so what you see is these cultures in India, everybody's got this like system of trying to appear older than they actually are. So what they do is they create these crazy long cycles. You see it, the Bible's riddled with it. Every priest class from the old world, they try to make these cycles seem so big to pass themselves off as being like an ancient culture. And it's kind of like what you were saying earlier, like it's to give them authority that they don't even actually have. Because if you really look into Indian history, they don't have shit. And if you look at how often they have to rewrite their religious scriptures and all that stuff, whether it's the Vedas, you name it, they have to do it every 10 years because the climate rotted the paper. And that's what the British found when they explored it anyway. So now you're trusting the priest class, who are known liars, to constantly be writing everything every 10 years and reimagining it or translating it the way they want to interpret it rather than what it actually said. And as a result, it's been really difficult. It gets to a point where history is so defiled by mythology that you can't separate the two. And so what comes after that, and what I try to focus on, including focusing on that, is exploring language, because language still contains its secrets. And the more words in a language, the more history it can unearth if you can figure out the origin of those words and what they originally meant. And so hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, get me back on track and I'll try to enucleate it a little bit better.
No. I think that we kind of touched on the point. I just wanted to make sure that people had that perspective, because we hear all these things about like the Kali Yuga and the different huge cycles and ages. And I know what isn't accurate about that. I don't doubt that Earth or this realm goes through cycles that are larger in some capacity, because we see the cyclical nature of what we call time every year, every Anu, right? But what you pointed out is the most important and crucial thing. And as it's quoted in chapter 1, by Grotius of the Netherlands. In chapter 1 of A God's Acre, he says, ecclesiastical history consists of nothing but the wickedness of the governing clergy. Like that nails it. And it's just no different than the scientism, right? Like they want to tell you they know the exact age of the earth and the exact age of the universe. And like, okay, this is very similar to all these other theoretical physics and things where it's mostly based on math and equations and algebra and abstraction. And in particular with the clergy, what they do, what I picked up from your book is that they have certain sacred numbers and ratios that they really believe have this mystical significance or connect to the allegorical characters that they want to create as historical figures, or that they believe in as historical figures, whatever the case may be. And then they attempt to adhere cycles of time to these particular numbers when it really doesn't work that way. Like trying to adhere a year to 360 days to make it a perfect circle. And when it doesn't, so they say, oh, well, that means we must know for sure that some cataclysm happened that knocked the earth off of its tilt in their whole ball thing.
Hold on.
Right?
What do you think about that, Chance? What's your opinion? Like, was the year originally 360 days and something did disrupt it, or the cycle of the sun might have changed, or do you think they just measured it wrong?
You see, my answer is I don't know. I don't know, but in terms of like, I think that it's a big assumption to think that you do know. However, I do, at least in terms of the psychology of human beings and their current condition, think that there is strong evidence for some huge cataclysmic trauma or cycles of cataclysmic trauma. What that is, where that came from, don't know, or how it worked, don't know. If I had to guess, I really think, to me, like my favorite trail is the idea of some sort of electrolysis type event in the larger battery superstructure of this realm that caused the growing of the earth, like actual additional land being added. There's a lot of mythology that supports that idea or allegorically encodes it. And to me, because I look at life as seemingly evident that things are self-similar across scale, it does make sense that there would be some sort of like growing happening with the actual physical earth that we have here, especially when you consider like geology and the science of geology and how backwards that is. It's exactly the same thing we're talking about. They make these claims about
carbon dating.
They make these claims about like how fast erosion happens. And like I checked out this book called The Geologist's Descent from Deep Time. And it's, an academic geologist who's talking about the rates of erosion that happen to the soil on the coasts, just in like the United States, for example, and how at the current rate of erosion, there would be, like the landmass we're on right now will be gone so much faster than what they say in terms of how long cycles go. So to me, it's like if erosion, especially coastal erosion, happens so quickly, and we have all these underwater civilizations that we find under the oceans, like to me, it makes perfect sense that a particular type of like what they call the mud flood would be some sort of additional earth being added to the system. Especially when we look at we brought up the Chaldeans, but there's the link between that word with like calendar and caldera. And me and some of my friends that get into this syncretism work regularly have made a lot of connections to the volcano aspect of whatever like the chief artificer, maker, deity is of these systems, and how you can connect that to the idea of Vulcan. And so something maybe is measurable in the cycles of the sun, perhaps, that will give people that have a longer view of history an idea of when perhaps another deluge event would happen. But to me, like the deluge might be mud as much as it is water. And when we look at how electrolysis works and how there's this sludge material that seems to kind of come out of nowhere with that process, maybe the Ragnarok is just the recharging of the battery that also resets the land so that there's enough land for life to grow on. I don't know exactly, but there's
definitely all kinds of weird things. Like I know people who have aquatic fossils on their farms in Texas, and there's also oil there. And obviously there's a grift going on with oil And I'm not the person to have on to talk about that, but everybody who's looked into it can kind of see that. But yeah, it's weird because you'll see people talking about the mud floods and stuff, but then you'll still see all these places that are exposed that have been carved and dated. And they're like, well, this is like from 10,000 years ago. And it's like, well, I thought the mud flood would have taken that out, you know? So it's like you see stuff in specific events or in specific locations. And I think it's related to specific events. I grew up on the ocean, and the shoreline is exactly where it was 30 years ago, when I used to leave my boat out on the beach, and, you know, you didn't have to have like permits and any of that shit. So it's hard to say, but there definitely does seem to be instances where things have changed a little bit. And one of the things I was looking at in my exploration of book 5 is just the Strait of Gibraltar, because that would have been a landmass connecting North Africa to Europe. And I wonder, it's such a narrow strait, if at some point maybe that was a land bridge and the Atlantic Ocean broke through that. And so that's what made the Mediterranean. And that would like account for things like, you know, when they say how like Atlantis, you know, first of all, there's no evidence of Atlantis. So anybody who's claiming that, throw that out the window. There's not anything serious that you can stand on with that. But if we're going to speculate, something like that would make sense, right? Like if there was land in what is the basin of the Mediterranean Ocean now, and it got wiped out as a result of that Strait of Gibraltar breaking through in the Atlantic flooding, then you could make the case for some of these things. But it's just interesting. The reason I asked, because in my new book, and this is nothing new, everybody in this space kind of knows that the Americas have been visited and the ancient world knew about the Americas. But I'm going to use my skill set to show how the Mexicans, speaking of that calendar, this is what started that, is they had the same calendar as the Egyptians. So it was a 300-day year, but they inserted the 5 intercalary days. Those are the dead days. So
you mean a 360-day year?
Yeah, sorry, 360-day year,
yeah.
But they inserted the 5 dead days. So it's really interesting how cultures who have no connection to each other could share the exact same astronomical mistakes. And the fact that they have like Egyptian and Greek style architecture when they didn't even have they didn't know how to smelt iron. They didn't have the ability to make tools like that. They didn't have use of letters, but they somehow spoke what the Jesuits called a corrupt Hebrew. And they dismissed that by saying, well, it's because they're of the devil. That's why they speak a dialect of Hebrew. And so book 5 is going to further destroy Mosaic history. And I think that's the best thing about Spirit World, is it's a chainsaw that destroys it all. I don't play favorites. I serve the truth, and that's it. And once you can debunk Mosaic history, there goes Christianity. The next domino to fall is Islam. And the further you go back, I take Hinduism down, Buddhism. I expose all of it. The Celtic stuff, being somebody who, what I'm exploring now with book 5 is showing the language in Ireland, how they use the same 17 letters that the Phoenicians gave to the Greeks, no more. And how all these languages in the UK are sympathetic to what people would call Hebrew, like the Welsh is comparable to Hebrew. And that's one of the first subjects we decided that you wanted to go into first, was language. So if you want, without further ado, we can
let's see your
ideas
notes,
back and forth, but we can get into, so what we're going to do with language, this is all book 5 material. So if you're in the audience and this interests you, catch up. But what is important to note is there's this language that exists or existed called Sanskrit. And I think a lot of people are familiar with it. And it shares over 30, probably more words with Latin, with Irish. And so you can see that these are all these are all the exact same language, just dressed up differently. And going into language, I was actually just thinking about this today or yesterday, but I was thinking about it this morning too. is that if you think about it, all language is the same. It's just different people trying to convey their ideas of what they need and their emotions or whatever else. And babies speak their own language. Everybody speaks their own language. But what is unique is that certain groups of people develop systems. And so the things we speak are dialects of the same thing. But the things that get written down and created, those are going to be the actual languages. And so there's a very unique thing that nothing else is like, and that is Sanskrit. And it's the only language where the words adhere to the grammatical rules. They've still been preserved as a priestly language. There isn't a written or spoken language formed by rule except for Sanskrit. You could make the case of the Agam, the Irish Agam, but it's not really, I mean, that one's a little bit different. And I don't want to get into it right now because it's another conversation, but this might be an indication that Sanskrit itself is modern in the sense that I think it has like 52 letters. Some of them they're double letters, right? But it, because it has all the same words, or not all of them, but because it has so many similar words with Latin and the ancient Irish and all that stuff, the Highland language, it indicates that they came from the same source. So even though Sanskrit, and the reason this is important is because the Etruscan language, Etruria, this would be today in Italy, it would be Tuscany, it would be Lazio, Umbria. When that gave way to the Roman Empire, so what they find is that the Etruscan language, which is like the oldest that we have, at least in the Mediterranean region of languages, it's the Phoenician, right? It's like a 13-letter alphabet. That is like a devolving or an improvement. I don't know whether it's an improvement or devolving. It's hard to say, but it's coming from Sanskrit. And
you
so
can be some of both.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you look at it. And I think in book 4, I said it was a corruption. And so then Latin becomes a corruption of Etruscan. But in a way, when people take language and do their own thing with it, even though they don't play by rules and they fuck it up with carelessness, certain things kind of improve. So I don't know whether to call it, let's just call it a corruption from now. But you got Sanskrit, you got Latin, you got Etruscan, then Latin. And the reason it's hard to pinpoint this the newer version of Sanskrit is because of all these old languages that come from it. But how could those old languages with so few letters come from something with so many letters? So it looks like the Sanskrit that was like known towards the more modern era, that was like the improvement of whatever they all came from. But we're just going to call it Sanskrit for the sake of conceptualization. And for the audience's benefit, that just means holy writ.
Yeah, and they even sometimes pronounce it in India, Sanskrit.
Sanskrit, yeah, sun, the language of I was almost going to name book 5, the language of the sun, but I'm not going to because
I like Holy Sailors, if that's the working title.
Because it is, because that's the Etrurians and the
But
Phoenician.
it also reflects the whole Argo, the sun being often allegorized as a deity that's riding some kind of boat in the sky.
Yeah.
Too.
It's freaking wild, but it really is. It's the language of the priests of the solar cult. And so every other language outside of that is basically a language of circumstances. And it gets improved by grammarians, but it also gets changed by the vernacular of the masses, even though the language starts off as like a priestly creation. But this gentleman named Babington, he claimed that the Sanskrit in South India was written in characters that were derived from Tamil. And Tamilese is not derived from Sanskrit. It's a language, whatever they came from, it's a language that no longer exists. And but from that Tamil comes all these other ones we're more familiar with. And so the status quo will admit that Hebrew and Arabic of the Quran, they became dead and learned languages, right? they weren't understood by a culture or masses until they were made common. And once common, a secret language will diverge from the originals until they're barely recognizable. And so that's what you see a lot of like in Britain as well. But the vernacular spoken by the so-called Jews was Syriac. It wasn't Hebrew. And so Hebrew is a learned but not spoken language, just like we today would learn Latin. But we can't go anywhere and find people that speak Latin. And so my audience understands that Hebrew and Arabic were just forms of the priestly language made common, and that no culture or people ever spoke either of them until they were made common in the Middle Ages. By the way, for anyone who doesn't know the history of Hebrew, go look up the vowel point system. But that's why they had to create that, is because they had to teach people how to speak it. And
so I want to point out too, like, so part of why maybe, in my opinion, these, dead languages that are then taught, that are learned languages, first of all, that entire concept reminds me of like legalese, and how there's a specific corporate corpse oration, dead language, dead speak that is kept like in a sort of copyrighted form where it doesn't change, it doesn't evolve, just the way that like Latin is not a language that is ever changing. It's not really spoken anymore. To me, whenever you see like that the languages that the people eventually do get are sort of reduced versions or just a segment, not the full alphabet, things like that, it reminds me of how the slave owners in the United States during the era of slavery had frequently like would strategize with one another about how to best manage their slaves. By their primary way of doing it was to make sure that they only had the words and concepts in their language as slaves that they needed to do their job, and to be unable to imagine a life different or better from the life they had. So to me, that's probably why like the origin is big, but then how it gets deployed in different regions is just segmented.
I think you see them doing that to us today with English, because English has a lot of words. And I think that's what makes English so special, is because it's an amalgamation. Even though it's the same system, it's infused with everybody else's language. English does share a lot of Greek. But going back to what I was saying about the reason that's important is, I've put this out there in my books before, and I do this very carefully. I'm very calculated, because I like to leave people enough rope. So if they try to go against what I'm saying and like slander me online or whatever, they're going to destroy their reputation. But I'll say things like Hebrew is Masonic language. People much smarter than me, much more experienced than me, have told you that, if you know what you're looking for. And the Masons, and I'm not just talking about these, frat club that you see in the last couple hundred years. I'm talking about all Masonry. They are all priests, because when you see all these historical edifices, the reason the stonework lasts is because they were usually temples, and sometimes palaces or like ramparts, city gates, city walls, whatever. But in order to build these things, they did it with systems. And in order to know those systems that they did it, it mirrors astronomy and the cycles of heaven. And so every Mason was a priest, but not every priest was a Mason. But going back to English, so that's what I mean when I say these languages are Masonic. They are of the priest classes. They are a system of communication in secret. And this goes back to why the Agam was created. It means a secret letter system. It's from India. Akam, secret. So going back to English and like how it's got all these Greeks. Well, even Josephus says, or how it has all these Greek words, whatever. Even Josephus says there is not any writing which the Greeks agree to be genuine among them, older than Homer's poems. But here's something else that is interesting about Homer. Plato lived in the 4th century BC, and this is going to show how grammar evolved. So he's claimed to be the first one that considered grammar. And this is just status quo, so don't shoot the messenger, please. I'm not making claims. I'm just telling you what the status quo is, because I don't even know if these people are historical, to be honest with you.
Well, let's just say about Homer that he's a really quick point. In the Greek, they often, the eta, the H doesn't have the h aspirate sound. It's just kind of like a silent. So Homer, Om. And if that doesn't hit, then just go even on Wikipedia, you can find information about the Greco-Buddhist empire and how there's this bridge culturally between the ancient Hellenic world and the Buddhist and the Hindu and the Indian regions. And then we have the LR phonetic switch between languages. So Homer is also saying Om L, and we know about L.
Yep. And Ir is going to be related to cycles. So it's the cycle of Om. There's no getting around it. This is all constructed, but it's part of an Indian tradition. So a lot of these people, they take epithets or pseudonyms that are based on the sun gods, or there's some sort of encoding like that. So it's you have to decide what you're looking at. Is it historical or is it allegory? I have kind of a rule of 3 that we're going to get into in this about whether I determine something. There's only so many coincidences one person can have in relation to astrotheology before it's mathematically impossible that their entire life isn't a construct.
It confuses the issue too when you look at modern characters like Rasputin. That Rasputin seems or even Vladimir Putin seems like in some instances these leaders and historical figures even in recent history have some astrotheology encoded in their story. And anyway, that's kind of a caveat, but that gets really confusing.
Ras, as you see, means wisdom, right? You see this in Raj. I'm going to go into this too, but Put, Boot, these are dialectical words of Buddha. There's if you look into Asia, there's 1,000 different ways to say Buddha. So Ras, Put, and right? That's literally the wisdom of Buddha in that name. Whether that's an accident, whether somebody created that, I can't tell you. I'm not going to make claims about stuff I can't know, but I can tell you just linguistically looking at it, that's undeniable. And I can demonstrate it in multiple languages.
And Putin in Russian means the way or the path. So Ra's, Putin, the way of Ra, it's the way of the sun.
Yeah. Yep. And Buddha is the sun. There's a Buddhic trinity as well. So going back to this grammar, how this starts, because we just got to debunk Homer once and for all. Aristotle was the first who wrote on grammar, allegedly, and then reduced it to an art. And then Epicurus was the first who publicly taught grammar among the Grecians. Now, if this is true, and I don't know that it is, but if it is, then Homer's poems must be indebted almost entirely to Aristotle and his companions for the perfection of that language. Well, this is a problem because Homer's work is claimed, if you go look it up, they say, it's circa the 7th and 8th centuries BC. But they don't know. And if Plato lived in the 4th century, how is some dude using all this shit before the 4th century? Especially when Josephus just said that there's not any Greek writing alleged to be genuine older than Homer's poems. But if Homer's poems can't be older than the 4th century BC, then what the fuck? So
applying green language to Aristotle, you get Ari, which is river or lion, and Thoth, which is Thoth, which is Hermes, which is Mercury, which is Jesus is the sun, and L, Aries, Thoth, L. Yep. It's in everything.
And Totle, you see that Teotle in Mexican too. And so Tot, for anybody's watching, it's just right, T-O-T. That's another name for Buddha. It's not a stretch. You will see that. You will see rings with Tot written on it. That's where you have the Tutates, Tuis, Teutonic Knights. This is all Celtic. And what I can show is it goes back to India, but I don't know the depth of it. I'm not ready to because what I'm seeing with Italy is so intense, and what I'm seeing with the America is so intense that we might be looking at something with, if you look at the Umbrians, who were before the Etruscans in Italy, And for everyone who doesn't know this, Italy is Celtic. That's why, like, even today, like, people with I in their last name, they look like more like when your name ends in I in Italian, it's going to be an indicative that you're from northern Italy. So a lot of those people look Scandinavian. They still speak German in like a lot, or in like places like Alta Adige. But what I'm looking at with Egypt, the place that we call Egypt, but it was never called that. But I'm just saying that for conceptual purposes. There's not one hieroglyphic on the 3 Great Pyramids. So what you're seeing is an older civilization, whatever that was, whether there was abandoned or not, or there was a collapse or not, you see a new civilization built upon it. And we have been taught that the empire that's doing these sacred glyphs are the same as the ones that built the pyramid. And it's observably not the case, because you wouldn't build pyramids and not have hieroglyphics anywhere on them. So it's crazy. But one thing to consider, and I said this on my last episode of Crow, which was episode 416, people, again, much smarter than I have proven that the life of Homer is the life of Virgil. The Aeneid versus the Homeric work. So that's just something to consider, because a lot of the times they're just recycling a lot of bullshit. And according to Suetonius, the art of grammar was first brought to Rome about 170 years BC, and by a gentleman named Crates Malotes. And he was the ambassador from King Attalus to the Roman Senate. Another thing that's really interesting about Rome, because we're talking about all these like ras, wisdom. You know, Buddha means old man, but it's indicative of wisdom. Well, you also have the Pali, who are from Tamil. And so they're also known as the Philistines or Philistines. And then that language, the Pushto language, it's also called Estrangelo. It's resembled the Chaldee, according to a gentleman named Sir William Jones in his Asiatic researches. And what he noted is Chaldee is basically an older version of Hebrew. People will really have to dive into book 4 that we're promoting here, A God's Acre for Winds of the Soul, to see why that's significant, why it relates to the doctrine of wisdom, because there's a lot written about it. But you'll find this phonetic, you'll find this Pali in places like Rome, Palatine Hill. You'll find it in Palestine, right? The stone of Pallas. You'll find it in the goddess of wisdom, Pallas Athena, Palladium. But you got to remember that this B and P.
Charlemagne and his Paladins.
Exactly. Yep. That's what I'm saying. It's everywhere. And that P and B was interchanged by the Pelagi, the holy sailors. And so there's some amount of evidence that they came from Bali, or that part of that system was in Bali, right? And because Bali is also God, and it even says, thou shalt, in the Bible, thou shalt no longer call me Bali. And Baal, Bol. So in Hebrew, the problem with this word, the reason why this is so fucked up is because these modern corrupt, whatever you want to call them, that call themselves, Jews or whatever, they have fucked up everything. They were absolutely careless with the language. So if you were to spell Baal in Hebrew, like the old Chaldee way would just be BL, right? Bet Lamed. But the way they do it in Hebrew is Bet Ayin Lamed. And Ayin is an O, so it looks like BOL. So you have all this confusion of shit, of language, and the Greeks were really bad at this too, careless with the language. And so for people like us, it's easy to see how these little errors or these little changes happen over time. But for the average person, because it's not exact, they're going to look at it and be like, you're crazy. You're just seeing what you want to see, because they don't know how the cultures change them. And when you look at these early people, these Syriac, and from that area of Syria, and they become the Phoenicians, and they're connected to whatever was in Egypt, whatever that was, I don't know. I'm trying to get to the bottom of. But that band of people that become adventurers, that become Phoenicians, that basically set up these maritime empires, they interchanged the B and the P. So Bali is Pali. Pelagi is Belagi, Baal, the Lord. So you can see whenever you're seeing that PAL or PEL, it's all related to the same thing. And it's related to the gate, Pila. And why that matters is because the symbol is, Janus guards the gates. He's the god of the doors, the gates of the year. And he comes from Ganesh, right? Ganesh, the elephant. So you see this symbolism, and this elephant symbolism of the sun in winter was found not far from the tower on the estate of Lord Castles. And so there was also found a ring with a cobra, the linga, the yoni, which indicates these superstitions had to have come from India. And it did so while that Celtic, Hebrew, whatever that language is, it did so while that was in use, because the Irish have all those early letters. And if you look at those letters from Cadmus that allegedly, that whole story is like astrotheology, so you can't rely on it. But at least in that astrotheology, they're saying that he gave those letters to the Greeks in 500 BC. So if there's any truth to that, and again, I have to it's embarrassing because I have to beg the question, if there's any truth to that, at the very least, that's how early the Irish got it, because it's the same 17 or 16, but people made the case for 17 as well. And what's interesting is when you go back into, the further you go back to try to look at where does this shit start, you start seeing that like some of these languages, the early languages are numerical. And so they're not spoken languages. And so this is why you see with all these languages, whether it's the Greek, the Irish, they all have the Hebrew, they all correspond to numbers. Well, this is so you can convey meaning without understanding each other. It's kind of like Morse code or sheet music. Everybody can read it, but we might not be able to communicate, but we can play the same notes that are listed. And so the Romans used literary characters as numerals and in alphabetical order as the Chaldeans did. And that was as late as Julius Caesar's time. Now in the 6th century, I've seen claims of that they dug up a Julian calendar that was in Rome. And the days of the month were numbered by letters in alphabetical order. So they would, instead of like 1, 2, 3, they would start with A, B, C, D, so like the first day of January would be A, B, C, and it would go to H, or the 8th day. And then it would begin again. And so these interesting things that have been claimed over time, they tell a story. But the problem is, what happened to that calendar? Did it get destroyed? Has it been covered up? So it's cool to see the accounts, but for me, before I can like really run with that, I need to see it in the physical world. You know what I mean? But the oldest written language is an early language of calling things by numbers and knowing what they refer to based on context. And that's not to say the earliest spoken language. I'm talking about like actual written things. And so all language is technically the same. Like I said earlier, how I was thinking about whether it's babies or old people, it's just a way of communicating thoughts and needs. And we'll do that regardless if there is some sort of technical system of symbolism to write with or communicate with signs. But in terms of ascribing symbols to sounds or names, a thing itself, a number, the combination of these ideas with others to expand meaning or context, the first language in writing was likely through numerals. And even people today, you'll hear all over the world, math or numbers, they're the universal language. And like I said, look no further than sheet music. You can read sheet music from hundreds of years ago and still play it. And you can't communicate with the artist that wrote that. You don't even, if he wrote in his native tongue, most of you wouldn't be able to understand that. But you can understand his sheet music by learning the sheet music. And so in Asian cultures, we see the languages of characters or symbols that look like an improved and evolved system of the primitive numerical language that I'm suggesting. And Tamil's characters, their extreme simplicity indicates that the language is of high antiquity. I've got some thoughts about that, but just this is what some of the best people that I could come into contact, this is some of the things that they've written about. And so the Sanskrit of South India was written in characters derived from Tamil. So it looks like Sanskrit came from Tamil, not Tamil coming from Sanskrit, or whatever was before them. And so some are of the opinion that the Tamilese, the Chinese, the Hebrew, the Ethiopian, and the American languages, like the Mexicans and all that stuff, they evolved from an ancient language of the Chinese on account of it being close to Hebrew. And then the other tongues, they're all considered like they're as well the dialects of that. But none have demonstrated, this is the challenge, no one's demonstrated beyond dispute what occurred between picture writing and letters before they could attempt to account for the formation of an alphabet. But like I said, it looks like it was numerals, because numerals would be the most needed for ledgers and commerce. And I don't want to fall back on cuneiform or any of this stuff, because I've seen people do that, like forge that stuff. It's really easy to forge. So if it's a forgery, it could be bullshit. But I've heard like a lot of these tablets and stuff, they're really just ledgers of like trade ledgers and accounting. And I think this is the reason for the Egyptian hieroglyphs getting grabbled, because to connect letters directly with pictures, like the reason that being is because if you look at some of the work that came with like the Rosetta Stone and the people who interpreted them, one of them was Champollion. And if you look him up online and you look at like portraits of him, he's doing the hidden hand, and he's hiding his hand in the breast of his pocket in his portrait. And to me,
and let's just point out his name.
Yeah.
Champion of Apollo.
Yeah. But I still think it's worth including his work just because I can't prove it. It's just, there's things that I suspect. And so I don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's hard to say, right? All of this is hard. We don't know what era the hieroglyphics were created in because they don't exist in the Great Pyramids. So it shows you're looking at two different cultures at a minimum. And that's not even saying that there could be even more, right? And not only that, the reason they're covering this up is because it needs to preserve Mosaic history. Because like I said, once you destroy Mosaic history, all of Jewish history is a fable. And that's why when you look at the earliest Greek writer that mentions Moses, well, that's Cassius Longinus. And then what's the problem with that? It's the second half of the 3rd century. So you mean you got to be relying on accounts from Jews about their own history. And you see the same bullshit that you see with the Indians. Oh, we're this many hundreds of thousands of years. You know what I mean? It's like the same bullshit of trying to pass yourselves off as an older culture than you actually are. Because if everybody found the truth about you, you're a product of the modern age of the priests trying to create a priestly people, the Cohens. That's what a priest means, Cohen. And so this is not a new idea, but it's still challenging to piece this together because the shit that they would have written on is of a perishable nature, which is why the Irish Ogham, they're, people who actually carved in stone, that's really significant. The Scandinavians, and even though you don't really find anything before like the 8th century or the 7th century, it's still good that they carved this shit in stone because it's there. But the stuff that's written on tree bark and all that stuff, all the leaves, the papyrus, all that, it's rotted, But in my searching for all of this, I think the answer can be found in the Javanese people. In the island of Java, it's Indonesia. It has almost 150 million people now. But if you look at it, the spelling of it, Java, well, it literally looks like Jova or Jove, philologically. It's the same word. And so when you look into the Javanese, well, they're sailors and they're shipbuilders, or dare I say, bridge builders, because a brig is a bridge and it takes you over water. it's also a wartime vessel. But the reason I'm nodding to the pontifical system is because pontifex means bridge builder. And most bridges make an arc. So the best bridge builder is going to be the Pontifex Maximus, the Pope, who would be the great architect.
Yeah, and then the idea that a bridge is also in the middle between one thing and another. And that's the entire MO, top to bottom, whether you're talking about the church being your intermediaries, or you're talking about the middlemen in mercantilism that skim the profits off the top between your business relationship with another human being. You know, this middleman thing is becomes very parasitic when it's no longer really a bridge. It's more like a gatekeeper.
You see the same thing with the mob and the freaking unions. So if you're in the mob and you're a made man, you get access to whatever you want, baby. You're not? See ya.
This and also in Hollywood, and like it's just the exact same system across the board. Corporate overworld, criminal underworld, whatever it is.
Our entire civilization is based on it. And that's why it was so important for me. It's not like I like breaking people's worldviews and showing them that everything they thought it was the truth is a lie. But if we want to get out of this system and remove its authority, we have to be willing to look at the priest system that it comes from. And that's why I did that, because that great arc, right? Well, I've gone over this in one of the other things we did with Pat, but when we were talking about Bereshit in the beginning, well, it's Rasit, and it means wisdom, because Ras pertains to the head. Just that's why in the Greek version it says arche, because it's the head. If it was first, talking about something being done first in order, they would have said protos, right? Protogenos, firstborn, right? So the greatest arc would be the royal one, that of the sun. And the pontifices at one point were likely literal bridge builders on account of them being masons, because that's how you have to know all this shit to literally build civilization. And so ras and arche mean top or head. Pons is a bridge, right? But if you look at Pontios, that's a name for the sea. And it's poetically describing like an open expanse, like the great wide open, or the big blue, yonder, if you will. It's a poetic way of describing the sea. So the Pontifex Maximus is not just the greatest bridge builder, but also the maker of the sea, or the god of the sea. And that would be Mars. Or as we would say in the Etruscan, right? Well, we're called Rasena. We're the Rasena, Ras. Just like the Rashaputs, just like the Rashid, just like Rosh Hashanah means head, Ras, head. God, Aesir, Isar, Asir, Nordic, Odin, all of them, Caesar, it's all the same thing, the sun. So keep in mind, going back to the brig or the brigantine, which is a warship, and the bridge, they share that same root. And so the ancient Britons were called brigantes, right? Some people say, well, that's because they're disruptors. Well, yeah, that's what those ships do. Obviously, they're newer than brigantes and way newer than the Roman system, but this is all based on the same symbolism. And the idea is encoded in these words. And so going back to Britain, why this is important, what you were just saying, the Roman cardinals, that's what cardinal is, comes from cardea, a hinge. So they're literally hinges. And that's what you have at Stonehenge, the hinge of the Lord, stone, Pater, Petra, Peter, Janus, Jupiter or Jupiter, the father, Jehovah or Jew, Sir, Tyr. Sir means Lord, but at rock. The capital Phoenicia, spelled Tyre, it's pronounced Sir, and it means rock. And it's symbolic of the Lord. And so this
the rock star, the Zoroaster.
Exactly. It's all the same. It's the same system. And this significance of the arch, or Ras, is seen in Rajaputs, or the Rajputs. That's what they're called now, the royal Buddhas, because Put is another name for Buddha. Like I said, the righteous, Al-Rashid. And I've seen another thing in Arabic that Ar-Rashid means God, and head of the year, Rosh Hashanah, and the Etruscans called the Rasena. And so getting back to Javanese, why this island is important is I came across this gentleman. basically all of the people that look similar. I was trying to figure out if the Americans were from Asia, who could they be from? And I'm just looking at old photos, black and whites, you name it. And because the reason I did that is because there's accounts of bearded tribes. Now, the problem with these accounts of bearded tribes is they never say what color eyes they have. So I wonder if it's bullshit or not. That being said, they also have so-called tribes of, they call them Negroes back then because it wasn't a bad word. It wasn't politically correct. It just means black, right? So we can call somebody black, but we can't call them black in another language because that's offensive, whatever the fuck that's about. But these tribes of Negroes were already here. And the Javanese fit the description because if you look at the people of Java, there's an island. This is what made me look into this because they look like a blend of Asian, Indian. They look like all of them. They're like an amalgamation. It's hard to explain until you want to go for your audience. Go look up Javanese or Java and Google Images and just start looking at old pictures. It's fascinating. But the reason I looked into this is because there's an island that was noted in a fictional Arabic story that was said to exist in the Sea of China, and it was called Awahaki. Now, an Arabic explorer in lived in like the 9th and 10th centuries, like the end of so like let's say the 9th century. I think he died in like 912 AD. But he mentioned Awahaki, writing that the islands are so rich in gold that the inhabitants make the chains for their dogs and the collars for their monkeys of this metal. And they manufacture tunics woven in gold. And excellent ebony wood is found in this island. And gold and ebony are the main export, or they were exported from Awahaki. Now, he seemed to believe that, even though it was a fictional story. But then literally over like 500 years later, a Portuguese apothecary named Tome Pires wrote of Java, actual Java, real, not writing of a fictional story. He said, they had many fine hounds with collars and rings of gold and silver. Now, me speculating, Awahaki is so phonetically similar to Oaxaca and Mexico. So once you remove that al, Oaxaca becomes Oaxaca. And this is really interesting because it bridges the affinity of the language between the Indians and the Americans. And there's a lot of people that would say, well, yeah, but that X in Mexico is pronounced like an H. The reason I looked at this is because the second word of Oaxaca is Xaca, an old name for Buddha, Saka, which begets the Saki, which begets the Saxons. The Latin word for stone, Saxum, Saxum. Well, I will remind all those people that would say I'm, going a little too far into the speculating, that Mexico was named after their leader, Messi, Mesi.
Oh, wait, you mean like
Mexico?
You mean like the Moshe? You mean like Moses?
Yeah.
You mean Messiah?
Yep, all of it.
The anointed?
And that's why their religious rites are this is what I'm saying. Remember how we were talking pre-show about what the deciding factor is. Do we as people just create these things and we're running the same, I don't know.
Yeah, is it like this innate archetypal thing that comes through us and that's why there's this syncretic thing? Or is it one system that it all derives from originally,
Well, that the bizarre rites, that's what for me seals the deal that it's an old system. It's the bizarre rites. It's not the because I understand people, well, if we're all running a similar biological software, we're going to tend to think similar. We're going to tend to create similar, systems perhaps. But when you start seeing the bizarre religious rites whether it's the linga worship, right? Like, you see the Muslims going into India and destroying everything, but leaving the simple images of Buddha and leaving the linga, the phallus, that symbolism intact. You see that phallic symbolism in every major city that's controlled by the solar cult. What I was going to say is there's mathematical certainty. So going back to what I was saying about how like the language in Ireland, Rome, Sanskrit, and English, when you see it all being the same, there gets to a point where it's a mathematical impossibility after, I think, 8 words.
All right, people. So we had a little bit of a technological glitch, but here we are. About an hour later, but still determined to keep this thing going. We've kind of gone over the first hour time window, so you're welcome for that, everybody. But Dylan's going to continue where we left off, talking about the mathematical improbability of languages sharing words, and we'll finish some thoughts, but then expand further in the direction we're on here when we hit the second hour.
Perfect. And to the audience, I'm going to be looking down just because I took out my mic because I think that was the software was slowing my computer down. And that's why it crashed. So it's not personal that I'm not looking at you. But the point that I was making and all the stuff we were talking about, going back to these Javans, the Javanese, is that they were a bridge between cultures that used symbols and numerals as letters in the alphabet. So even if that island I was telling you about, Awahaki, that idea, if that's nonsense, the suspicion of the Javanese being connected to the Americans is still in play, because you have to decide, how did the American Indians get here? Did they get here by the land bridge, as the status quo told us? Or was there an advanced maritime empire in Asia that was able to get them here? Now, I have a feeling that the Americans were called Indians because the people of the previous ancient maritime empires, whether it's the Carthaginians, anybody in Europe, we don't know what Egypt was at this point, so it could have been them. So whoever they were, and however many, whether it's the ancient Irish, right, the Phoenicians, I think they knew that the Indians or the Americans were actually from India, which is why they called them Indians. I don't think it was a product of Columbus accidentally finding something he thought was India. Anyhow, this quote I wanted to read was from a gentleman named Stanford Raffles, and this is what I believe ties this Mexican culture to the Indian culture. And like I said, just to refresh the audience's memory, the reason this matters is because when they found the Mexican culture, they had the same mythoses as the Christians and Jews. Their dialect was basically Hebrew. They called it corrupt Hebrew, but they didn't have the use of letters, which means it couldn't have been brought by Europeans. Because if the Europeans had brought all that symbolism and stuff and those stories and that language with them, they would have brought the use of letters if it was brought by Christians and Jews. So what he wrote was, for ordinary purposes, the Javans use a modification of some of the letters of the alphabet as numerals. But on occasions of importance, it is usual to employ certain signs or symbols in lieu of these ordinary numerals. And this practice appears to be of great antiquity among them. These symbols consist in a certain number of objects, either represented in design or named, each of which is significant of one of the 10 numerals. Of the former class are said to be those found in the most ancient buildings and coins, which in that case usually bear no inscription. So if you want to chime in and talk about anything, we can. Otherwise, I'll continue to some of this stuff, how it plays into Ireland, and keep going on this subject. But I want to make sure I'm not hogging anything,
Oh no, dude. Yeah, I want really your stuff, and I'll take note of what I want to say and just put it into my outro monologue. But for this point, what we ought to do is just remind people where they can connect with you and how they can support you and where to access the work, and we'll finish up the first hour and flow into the second hour to continue where you're at.
Yeah. First of all, if you listen to this on YouTube, make sure you hit the like button, the share it, get it out there, because I'm censored and Chance is censored. He can't monetize his platform. So please share this video if you see value in it. That's the first thing. And it helps with the algorithms. And secondly, make sure, the content that I provide is incredibly valuable. So make sure you're subscribed to Chance on his Rockfin or his Patreon, however you can get this. It's worth it. So support Chance so he can continue to do what he's good at and provide a platform for all these different people that will educate you and bring stuff to your attention. So it'll help you in your own work. So support Chance. And if you're interested in what we've been talking about, the book series is called Spirit World. That's WHIRLED. My other series is The Tale of Onora, ONORA. I'd really like to get back to doing fantasy work, but, due to my own behavior with like online spats, stuff that's like common for us people in this space. But, I got canceled back in like 2015. My fantasy series was doing pretty well. And then, so what will happen is when you go on the first page of that, you'll see all negative reviews up front that people have voted. Same with like Goodreads and all that shit. You'll see it like thousands of fake reviews. But if you can get past that, it's a really good series. And I'd really like to get back to fiction writing and creating, more red pill, real man's fantasy. And so a lot of stuff in Tale of Onora is alchemical and stuff that I don't get into with Spirit World, wrapped up in some of my favorite stories and adventure. And what I'd really like to do is get back into making films. And I stopped all of that to do Spirit World because I saw the decay in our fucking country. It was just getting so bad that I had to do something about it. So Spirit World is a product of that necessity. But it's available anywhere online that sells reputable books. And it's available in pretty much all forms. Audiobook, support Chance. Chance is the narrator for book 3. And it's a great book. So there should be the links in the description. So give that a go. And yeah, hopefully it'll help you in your own life.
It definitely will. I mean, if you're here and you're interested in the stuff we talk about on a regular basis, then these books are required reading or listening or both. Like I have all the different versions of it because I reference it in different ways. But yeah, in book 4, there will be an audiobook of that. We're underway with the project. I can say with confidence that it will be completed pretty soon. And that's going to be also an excellent resource. So Dylan, thank you so much, man. I'm looking forward to continuing into the second hour.
It's my pleasure, brother.
Through the phonetic Kabbalah, Diana is Anadi. D, as in D-I, pertains to God, and I is interchangeable with Y. You don't have to go that far back in history to see words spelled with Y, where an I would be in modern English. Anadi is Anadi, as in Anadiomene. What is the omen of Diana? Venus Anadiomene is Lucifer rising from the sea, the pure sea, the Virgin Mare, Mary, or the Virgin of the Sea, Venus, Virgo Marina. Diana is connected to Inanna, which is connected to doors, Janua, or the year, Annus, and Janus. It goes like this: Diana, Janua, Annus, Janus, Janus. The cult of Jew Peter put the I in anus, just like they put the sex in your government or Congress and monetary system, commerce. Do you have the courage to walk through the Janua, or the door I've opened for you? The Virgin Mother is the Virgin Mary. In French, she is Notre Dame, Our Lady. In Sicilian, she is Matrice. In Latin, she is Mater, or Matrice. Same with Greek. Matrona connects to Madonna, which gives us Madonna in Italian. Morone. Does it take creativity to see that Matrice and Matrice are connected to matrix, which means womb? Most cathedrals are dedicated to her, or dare I say, Hera. What's in a symbol? What does the alchemist of Notre Dame in Paris wear on his head? What does Lady Liberty wear on her head? What did the sans-culottes wear on their heads during the French Revolution? What does Lady Columbia wear on her head? For all of you who grew up in the 1980s, what did Papa Smurf wear on his head? Is the Papa not the Pope? What does Mithras wear on his head? Does the Phrygian cap not signify an adept, an initiate, or an epopt in the Eleusinian mysteries? The Phrygian cap was called Liberia in Mithraism, symbolizing a freed slave, but became the supreme mark of initiation in Freemasonry. Cover yourself with this cap. It is worth more than a king's crown. What did I teach you about Jacob? What do you know about Jacobins? Is the symbol of the fasces they used not the same symbol of fascism that you see on each side of the United States maritime flag in the United States Senate? They gave you Columbia, Isis, Mary, Irene Venus, and Lucifer. The idea that Freemasons are not Luciferian is utter bullshit. Their symbols don't lie. All Abrahamics and cults from which they spawned are indeed Luciferian. Rhode was the wife of Helios. Rhodian law is the law of the sea, lex mercatoria, maritime admiralty. Rhode is Venus, the ocean. Rhode is Lucifer. Rhode Island is Lucifer Island, the ocean state. This archetype is further passed down as Zeus begets Poseidon, the god of the ocean, and Poseidon begets Despoina. Despoina, a figure in the Eleusinian mysteries, means the mistress. Is Despoina the mistress or the mystery? Is Despoina despotic? Is despotism brought to whatever nation uses her symbolism? Despoina is the Greek version of Domina, which is the lady, or noble lady. Who is Our Lady? Has she dominated your nation? Artemis is Despoina, the lady, and she is also Diana, who is Semiramis, Rhea, and Cybele, the female counterpart to Janus. Let us not overlook the female version of her, Semele, the mother of Dionysus or Bacchus. Who is Rhea's husband? Cronus, the god of fortresses. Depending on translation, the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 38 reads, "But in their place he will honor a god of fortresses, a god his fathers did not know, with gold, silver, precious stones, and riches." Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in and making it all the way to the end of the episode. And what you just heard was 5 minutes of the sample from July's End with Black Swans, Dylan's third book in the Spirit World series. That's the same sample that you would get if you went and checked it out on Amazon or Audible and wanted to try it out. So I don't think I've ever shared the sample on a podcast before. Figured this is a good time. And honestly, it's way overdue to have Dylan back on because I finished that particular project way long ago, months ago. I've promoted it where I can, but looking at the sales on the dashboard, definitely way more of you have not checked it out than have been listening to InnerVerse. So, you know what? Do what you want to do, but you're missing out on a lot of amazing gravy, a lot of very helpful syncretism if you don't go and dive into that book. If you did go ahead and buy the book from Dylan in the physical format or the ebook format, that is a good idea too. Honestly, to be completely real with you, probably the most valuable way to consume it would be to actually read it yourself. But consider this, because we're talking about languages and phonetics, looking at it on the page and reading it gives you all the information that you need visually to see how things look the same. But hearing me pronounce it, which that was like a lot of work to pronounce some of those things correctly, will also help you connect the dots. So I would, if it was me, I would actually get both versions. I do have both versions. So yeah, check that out in the show notes. There's always going to be a link to audiobooks that I've completed as I finish more of them. It's a really great, I don't know, side gig, I guess you'd call it. But damn, Dylan was just extremely well prepared today. This was maybe my favorite podcast appearance I've heard from him on any show, previous ones of my own or Crow or any of those others included. So if you want to hear the whole thing, we got way deep in hour 2. Dylan actually came prepared with like 8 different subjects that he had notes on ready to go. And we only covered off one of those 8 subjects. I think we touched on a few things from the others, but he didn't flesh them out the way he did this topic of languages and letters. I really appreciate it. We had a super good time. Even fighting through some technical difficulties made it super worth, the time that it took to deal with that tech stuff. I believe that what we delivered in terms of the conversation, mostly what Dylan delivered, made it super worth it on my end. Anyway, kind of rambling here. Let me just tell you, if you want to access the second hour, you probably know the drill. But if you're new around here, I do Rockfin or Patreon. Those are your 2 options for how to get the premium content, the second hour. It's more like the second hour and 20 minutes, maybe even more than that. I'm not sure. It's big. It's really big because we just needed to keep going until he finished all the notes so that we didn't leave it hanging, since he's not going to ever present that information anywhere else ever again. And, normally whenever there's, the plus extensions for the show, I'm not usually like trying to paywall content that you couldn't get from that guest some other way, some other place, maybe even for free. It's really more about supporting me. But this time that's actually an exception. You're not going to hear him talk about these things anywhere else at any other time. I don't think he's even going to include it in his books in quite the same form, even though this is information inspired from the 5th book that will be coming soon. So yeah, check it out, rockfin.com/InnerVerse or patreon.com/InnerVerse. Of course, there's links in the show notes for both of those. Please check it out. Please support what I'm doing here. I do a lot of free content, only asking for some of it to be paid for. And in this case, I think it's some of the most valuable and way worth the $5 or the $10, depending on which one you go with. In the second hour, a few of the things that we got into, just a few. We continued this exploration of Oriental languages and Occidental languages, the East and the West. And that was sort of a theme going through the whole thing. We talked about the Irish origins of civilization theory and kind of debunking it, not in a way to like throw shade at researchers who are into that idea, but just pointing out some flaws with that hypothesis. I appreciate the authors and researchers that have that theory and have put it forward, because they've gathered a lot of really useful information and they're syncretizing things that do have similarity and should be syncretized. Anyway, we also talked a little bit about the globe ball model, destroyed that. Again, here and there, we'd have to do that. We discussed a lot of things about Italy and Sanskrit and ancient Greeks and Sanskrit. Also had an interesting tangent into Sardinia. Also, we touched on the first 300 years of Rome as astrotheology. I took us into a side road about questioning the existence of these gods and goddesses as egregores in the psychic or astral plane, and kind of tried to pull a little bit of more personal, I guess, beliefs or perspectives out of Dylan, because Dylan doesn't like to go into that, his own subjective thing. He tries to keep it very like, this I can demonstrate, this I can prove, this is what's going on in the physical world. I appreciate that too, but I tried to pull a little bit of, because we want to hear what he really thinks, I'm sure. Who doesn't? A really fascinating thread on the lotus and the secret letters of leaves. Definitely kind of the origin of green language. And I mean like literally green language, having to do with ciphers that are based on actual physical leaves. Talked about the practical value of syncretism in our lives, Dylan's take on that, and the massive similarity between ancient Welsh and Celtic languages and Hebrew, like ridiculous similarity. And that's just a few of the things, but in general, like the whole arc, we kept coming back to until Dylan finished it and fleshed it out, the letters and numbers idea and alphabets, and just looking at that. So, man, it's really good. I hope you guys do get into the second hour. The first hour was incredible. And I'll just say, we're not really here to like crush people's spirituality or the value in some of these ancient mystery school traditions that have passed forward into today in the form of like Christianity. More like to just take the dogma out of it and take the things out of it that make you weak and subservient to middlemen. I love Christian people. I love all people, right? Like, I'm not here to rain on your parade or whatever. But whenever you limit yourself to just a particular specific dogma and like a historical view of these messiahs, I call them, you're playing right into the hands of the mob, like literally the deep church, the mob, the mafia. It's always been a parasitic game of getting between you and the creator, or between you and nature, and putting you in a metaphorical underworld, as in like you're under them. Come on, like whether you're Catholic or Protestant in terms of Christian, realize that whole tradition in the form it is now came from the Vatican, but where the Vatican got it came from way older, way earlier stuff, going back into India and maybe even into China. And that these are really like offshoots of Buddhism in a way. I know that might be hard to accept, but just as an example, all right, there's no goddess in Christianity, right? Then explain why the Vatican, which is in Italy, where the Italians are the descendants of the Etruscans, tell me why the Etruscans had a goddess of the underworld named Vatica. Okay. And also her name was sometimes like very close to the word vagina. And they built Rome on these hills. Well, this Vatican hill, these hills, you might consider mountains and hills to be like a masculine or something type of symbol, but this is goddess symbolism. The mound, the hill, this is the female, it's the boat, and then the mast or the pole or the obelisk on top of the hill, that's the phallus, that's the male side. So anyway, it never ends. I won't take up too much time here in the outro. I hope you guys liked it. We'll have Dylan on again sooner than later. There's so much to cover. This study of syncretism never ends. Like, we're really at the beginning, but it doesn't take very long into the study to get enough of the keys to be able to see this everywhere and de-hex yourself from mysticism. Just the same way that, you probably out there are no longer blindly trusting the science. Well, don't trust the mystics either. Trust neither of those things. Verify with the nature what you trust. I know that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to play us out in a minute with a good track, but I have to reiterate that we've got a lot of opportunities to work together, you and me, one-on-one. I'd love to do some tuning with my big tuning fork and my littler tuning forks. Incredible process that my client just yesterday said worth every penny. Okay. It's fun too. Like, we have a lot of fun with it. Check out my website, InnerVersePodcast.com/sound-healing. If you want more information about getting tuned up, getting your auric field, your energy, your bioelectricity in balance, it's amazing. I really love the modality. Or do some cards with me. We can do one-on-one oracle card, tarot, and I Ching sessions. You know, that's my favorite way to provide counseling if anybody does want counseling from me on some level. So I'm going to play us out with a track by my buddy Dean, aka Lucid, a newer song by him called Sultan. And I thought that was appropriate, especially because once you get the whole L to R switch in language, you realize Sultan, the soul, is like Sir. So Sir is the god or the sun or the rock. And then Tan etymology like connects to serpents, right? As does Sir, obviously. So Sultan is like the snake god. It is a name to demonstrate that whoever is granted the title Sultan is like, you know, a servant of the rock, the Petra, the father, or is the father serpent, the father sun, you know, the universal serpent that is making that analemma figure 8 in the sky, Lord 8, Hermes, Mercury, the sun. Yeah. So I hope you guys enjoy that track. Check the show notes for links to everything. Very excited to put this one out. Thanks for tuning in. Looking forward to more. Much love, everybody. Bye-bye.